Factoring, basic factoring, with me, Catherine. In this video, all we're going to do is talk about how to factor an expression. In the last video, we looked at terms and found their greatest common factor. We're going to do the same thing in this video, but now we're actually going to look at an expression. It's not too hard. The first thing we do is find the greatest common factor. Then we write the greatest common factor next to parentheses, divide the greatest common factor from the expression, and then write the quotient in the parentheses. Finally, we're going to use the distribution property to check. Sounds like a long process, but it's kind of cool. First, we have to find the greatest common factor in each term of the expression. 3x squared is the same thing as 3 times x squared. 9 is 3 times 3. And if we remember from the previous video, all we did was circle the greatest common factor. So in this case, that's 3. Now, we write that number. It could be a number and a variable, but in this case, it's just a number next to parentheses. Next is to divide out the greatest common factor from each part of the expression. So we're going to take 3x squared divided by 3. That gives us x squared. Negative 9 divided by 3 is negative 3. And guess what? That's it! Next, let's check just to make sure we're right. What we need to do is use the distributive property. We're going to take 3 times x squared, which is 3x squared. Then 3 times negative 3, which is negative 9. And hey, the product is the original. We did it! So 3 times x squared minus 3 is in factored form. Let's look at another one. The first thing we have to do is find the greatest common factor from each term. Hopefully you remember from the last video, when we look at exponents, the smallest one is the greatest common factor. Okay, so let's do this one. 9w to the 5th is the same as 3 times w to the 5th. 12w to the 8th is the same thing as 3 times 4 times w to the 5th times w to the 3rd. Now we're going to circle our greatest common factor, which is 3w to the 5th. Now I write that next to a parentheses, and I start dividing that from each term of the expression. So 9w to the 5th divided by 3w to the 5th is 3. 12w to the 8th divided by 3w to the 5th is 4w to the 3rd. And guess what? We did it! But let's check. Once again, we're going to use the distributive property. 3w to the 5th times 3 is 9w to the 5th. 3w to the 5th times 4w to the 3rd is 12w to the 8th. And guess what? That product is the original. So what does that mean? That means the factored form for this expression is 3w to the 5th times 3 plus 4w to the 3rd. Now that's not bad, right? Here's one for you to try. You're going to pause the video, try it, and then press play to check. All right, let's see how you did. The first thing we have to do is find the greatest common factor. 15g to the 9th is 5 times 3 times g to the 3rd times g to the 6th. 20g to the 3rd will be 5 times 4 times g to the 3rd. We're going to circle our common factors, which leaves us with the greatest common factor, 5g to the 3rd. We're going to write that next to the parentheses, and now we're going to divide each term in the expression by the greatest common factor. 15g to the 9th divided by 5g to the 3rd. Remember, 15 divided by 5 is 3, and when we divide exponents, we subtract. We're going to do it to the next term. 20 divided by 5 is 4. G to the 3rd divided by g to the 3rd, well, they cancel. And that's it. You did it. But let's check. We're going to use the distributive property. When I distribute
15g to the 9th
and then 20g to the 3rd. Awesome! The product is the original. So the factored form of this expression is 5g to the 3rd times 3g to the 6th plus 4. Let's look at this example. Now don't freak out because we have 3 terms. We're going to do the same thing. The first thing we have to find is the greatest common factor. 2z to the 3rd is 2 times z squared. 6z is 2 times 3 times z, And 4z to the fourth is 2 times 2 times z to the third. Some of you will be asking, why did I write down negative 4z to the fourth? It won't matter until we start dividing the greatest common factor. What is the greatest common factor? 2z. We're going to write that next to a parentheses, and now we're going to start dividing. 2z to the third divided by 2z is z squared. 6z divided by 2z is 3. And now this one we would say negative 4z to the fourth divided by 2z is negative 2z to the third. And guess what? We did it! Let's check. I'm going to use the distributive property. And guess what? The product is the original! Yay! So for this one, the factored form is 2z times z squared plus 3 minus 2z to the third. Some instructors will insist that you write the inside in descending order. In that case, we would have 2z times negative 2z to the third plus z squared plus 3. Either one is perfect. They're both correct. Now it's your turn to practice. You're going to pause the video, factor the expression, then press play to check. All right, let's see how you did. 14z to the fifth is 7 times 2 times z to the third times z to the second. 21z to the third is 7 times 3 times z to the third. 35z to the fourth, 7 times 5 times z to the third times z. We're going to circle our greatest common factor, and that turns out to be 7z to the third. Our next step is to write that next to the parentheses. Now we need to divide the greatest common factor from each term of the expression. 14z to the fifth divided by 7z to the third is 2z squared. 21z to the third divided by 7z to the third is actually 3. And then negative 35z to the fourth divided by 7z to the third is negative 5z. Yay! We did it! But let's check. We're going to use the distributive property. And guess what? The product is the original. So the factored form for this expression is 7z to the third times 2z squared plus 3 minus 5z. Once again, some instructors may ask you to put this in descending form. No problem. Let's look at this example. We have a whole bunch of stuff going on here. We have a number and two variables, but guess what? It's exactly the same. 8w squared times x to the fifth is 8 times w squared times x to the fourth times x. Let's review for a second. When I look at the variable w, I have w squared and w to the third. Remember, the greatest common factor will take the smallest exponent. That's why I have w squared. I didn't make w times w. When we look at the variable x, we have x to the fifth and x to the fourth. In this case, the smallest exponent is 4. And that's why, when I wrote the factors of 8w squared, x to the fifth, I wrote x to the fourth times x, because x to the fourth is the smallest exponent for the x variables. If that seems a little confusing, no problem, because I have a whole video all about it. You can always go back and refresh. 16w to the third x to the fourth is 8 times 2 times w squared times w times x to the fourth. So that gives us our greatest common factor of 8w squared x to the fourth. We're going to put it next to a parentheses, and now we're going to start to divide. When I divide, I end up with x, and then I divide again, and I end up with 2w. Cool! If you don't remember your exponent rules, I have a video for that too. Just go back and review. But guess what? We're done with this one. We're just going to check. We're going to use the distributive property, and it's the original because we're super good. So what is the answer? Well, in factored form, it'll be 8w squared x to the fourth times x plus 2w. If your instructor insists that you write this in descending order, Descending order not only looks at the exponents, but also looks at the letters, and you need to be alphabetical. So for this one, you should have in parentheses 2w plus x to be in descending order. All right, try this one. Pause the video, factor the expression, and then press play to check. All right, let's see how you did. 36q to the second r to the fifth is 9 times 4 times q squared times r squared times r to the third. 18q to the fourth r squared is 9 times 2 times q squared times 2 squared times r squared. We're going to circle our greatest common factor. Next step, write it next to a parentheses, and now we're going to divide it out. When we divide 36q squared r to the fifth divided by 9q squared r to the second, we end up with 4r to the third. Yes, that's a lot of q's and r's and numbers. But guess what? We're going to do it again. 18q to the fourth r squared divided by 9q squared r squared. We end up with 2q squared. And guess what? That's it. So let's check. I'm going to use the distributive property. And we're awesome because the product is the original. So the factored form is 9q squared r squared times 4r to the third plus 2q squared. Cool. All right, it's time for the self-check. You're going to pause the video, factor out the greatest common factor, and then press play to check. So let's see how you did. I'm going to show you the answers right away so you can check yourself. So if you did perfect, good job. But let's go through this just in case. 5z to the fourth is my greatest common factor. I'm going to divide that out of each term, and we end up with 5z to the fourth times 2z squared plus 5z to the fourth minus 1. When we check it, we use the distributive property. And guess what? We're right. Of course we're right. Let's look at the next one. In this one, 2x to the seventh, y to the fifth, turns out to be our greatest common factor. Let's divide it out. We end up with 7x. Yes, I'm not saying all these numbers and letters, blah, 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 blah. But when we divide, we end up with 3y to the fourth. When we check it, we end up at our original, which means we're awesome. Good job. Now remember, the only way you're going to get good at this is to practice, practice, practice. Make sure to subscribe because you don't want to miss another exciting episode of math. I mean, this is fun, right? Do you have a request? Let me know at picrustable@gmail.com. You can also pin me to Pinterest. That would be pretty cool. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait till we can get together in the next episode.